This podcast contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing content related to real-life events, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Murderology.
Murderology.
This is Darius.
Darius and Margot.
Today, we're going deep into Stockholm Syndrome.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating. We've got a ton of research and articles here.
Cool.
We're going to unpack this whole phenomenon that goes way beyond just hostages and kidnappers.
Right.
It even pops up in, like, abusive relationships, cults,
Yeah.
high pressure, sports coaching, all sorts of stuff.
It's really interesting how it blurs the lines between, like, the victim and the abuser.
Yeah.
It's not just brainwashing.
Right.
But it's like survival mechanisms and power dynamics.
Okay, so for those who haven't really explored this before, what exactly is Stockholm Syndrome?
So it's basically when somebody is held captive or they're in a situation with ongoing abuse.
Right.
They actually start to develop positive feelings toward their captor or abuser.
Ah.
These feelings can range, from gratitude for small kindnesses all the way to, like, genuine affection.
Right.
They might even defend the abuser's actions.
So this isn't just like a pop psychology term, right?
Yeah.
Is it a real mental health disorder?
Well, that's where it gets kind of tricky.
Okay.
It's actually not officially recognized in the DSM-5.
Which is?
That's the manual that mental health professionals use for diagnosis.
Gotcha.
Part of the reason is it's pretty rare and it's really hard to study.
Right.
And there's debate about whether it's like its own unique condition or just a bunch of common trauma responses kind of clustered together.
So it's like a gray area in psychology.
Yeah.
But even if it's not officially a disorder, it's clear that it has a real impact.
Absolutely.
To really understand this, we need to go back to where the term came from.
Okay.
The 1973 Norrmalmstorg bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden.
Yeah.
This event kind of put Stockholm Syndrome on the map.
Exactly.
It's the one everyone's heard of, right?
Yeah.
The hostage situation that went totally sideways.
Exactly. It was a convicted criminal named Jan Erik Olsen.
Okay.
Tried to rob a bank,
Uh-huh.
and it turned into this 6-day hostage situation.
Oh, wow.
He took 4 bank employees hostage,
Okay.
demanded a fast car, cash, and the release of his friend, a really notorious criminal named Clark Olofsson.
So we've already got a recipe for disaster here.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
What did the hostages do?
As the standoff just kept going on and on,
Right.
the hostages, they actually started developing positive feelings towards these guys.
Really?
Yeah. One hostage, Kristen Enmark,
Oh.
she later said that Olsen had actually been kind to her.
Kind.
Yeah, he soothed her nightmares.
Huh.
And he even, like, draped his jacket over her when she was cold.
Wait a minute. Didn't he also, like, give her a bullet as a souvenir?
Yeah.
Is that what we're calling kind in a hostage
Yeah.
situation?
Well, I guess when your reality is completely warped,
Right.
even little tiny gestures can seem like a really big deal.
Yeah, that's a good point.
In these situations, the captor becomes the victim's whole world, their only point of reference.
Yeah.
The hostages actually started fearing the police more than the captors. Yeah, they actually believed that the police would just storm the bank and they'd all get killed.
Oh, wow. So their sense of loyalty completely shifted.
Yeah.
It's like they were identifying with the captors.
Exactly.
And even defending them.
Yeah, during the negotiations, one hostage even called the prime minister,
What?
begging him not to let the police attack because she said Olsen wouldn't hurt them.
It's like a total reversal of the victim-perpetrator dynamic.
Exactly.
And this loyalty didn't just vanish once they were freed, right?
Right.
What happened after?
The hostages' behavior shocked everybody.
How so?
First, they refused to leave the vault
Wolves.
because they wanted to protect Olsen and Olofsson.
Oh, my God.
They even hugged and kissed them as they were being arrested.
No way.
Then later on, they refused to testify against them.
Wow.
And they even raised money for their defense.
That is wild. It's like their brains just flipped a switch to cope with this trauma.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a one-off, though, right?
No, not at all.
There are other examples of Stockholm Syndrome.
Absolutely. It's not limited to just hostage situations.
Okay.
Think about Patricia Hearst. She was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah?
She ended up joining their cause and even participated in a bank robbery with them.
And wasn't there also the case of Natasha Kampusch,
Yeah.
the Austrian girl who was kidnapped
Uh-huh.
and held captive for 8 years?
That's right.
And I read that she was devastated when her captor died by suicide.
Yeah. These cases, along with a lot of others, show that Stockholm Syndrome can happen anywhere. There's like this really severe power imbalance and control.
Right.
Cults, abusive relationships,
Yeah.
and even, as our research shows, in like toxic coaching environments in sports.
Okay, that is messed up.
Yeah.
This brings up a question I have, though.
Okay.
If somebody is showing signs of Stockholm Syndrome, how do they even get help?
Right.
This isn't like a broken leg. You can't just slap on a cat.
You're right. It is way more complex.
Yeah.
There's no one-size-fits-all treatment for this.
Okay.
But some approaches, like EMDR, that stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing,
Right.
and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, those can be really helpful.
Hold on. Those are usually used for like PTSD and anxiety.
Right.
How do they apply here?
So with EMDR,
Okay.
it can help process traumatic memories,
Uh-huh.
including those linked to the captor,
Okay.
and it can help the person to sort of reframe those memories
Right.
and detach the positive feelings that they've started to associate with the abuser.
So it's like rewiring the brain's response to those memories.
Yeah, in a way.
And what about CBT?
So that one focuses on identifying and changing negative thought patterns and behaviors.
Okay.
So in terms of Stockholm Syndrome,
Okay.
it could help the victim to challenge their rationalizations.
Of the abuse.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and recognize that, the dynamics of the relationship are not healthy.
So it's about breaking free from that mental trap they've been in. But it sounds like therapy alone isn't enough.
Right.
Don't they also need to understand why they felt this way in the first place?
You've hit on a crucial point.
Okay.
Psychoeducation is super important.
What does that involve?
So it's about helping victims to understand those psychological mechanisms behind their feelings,
Okay.
the power dynamics that are at play,
Right.
and the way that trauma has actually impacted their perception.
So it's like giving them the tools to take apart their own experience.
Yeah,
And reclaim their sense of agency.
exactly. It's about empowering them to move from a place of feeling like a victim
Right.
to a place of understanding and healing.
It's incredibly sad, though, to think that somebody could be so manipulated
It is.
and controlled.
Yeah,
This whole normal shug robbery, though, really just scratches the surface, right?
it does.
There's so much more to unpack.
There is.
And what's maybe even more fascinating
Yeah.
is the debate over whether Stockholm Syndrome should even be called a syndrome.
Oh, really? So some experts don't even think it exists.
It seems like it.
Wow.
This just got even more interesting. Let's dive into that after a quick break.
Yeah, it's a debate that really gets to how we understand trauma
Right.
and how it affects people.
Right.
So some experts argue that instead of calling it Stockholm Syndrome,
Uh-huh.
we should use terms like traumatic bonding
Okay.
or captivity bonding.
So instead of seeing it as like its own separate mental disorder,
Right.
they see it more as like a general response
Yeah.
to trauma, to
Mhm.
extreme situation.
Exactly.
But why the change in language? What's the difference?
It's about moving away from saying it's like a disease,
What?
what might actually be a normal human response
Good.
to a totally abnormal situation.
Right.
Think about it.
Okay.
You're trapped. Your life could be on the line.
Yeah.
You completely depend on this person
For everything.
for everything.
Yeah.
Your brain is just trying to survive.
Right.
It's looking for anything, any little sign of hope.
So even small acts of kindness from the captor
Right.
would take on huge significance.
Exactly.
It's almost like your brain is saying, see, maybe it's not so bad.
Yeah, and that's where the bonding happens.
Okay.
Your brain might actually start connecting good feelings with this captor. Not because you've been brainwashed or anything,
Right.
but because those good feelings mean survival.
So it's like your brain is trying to trick you
It is.
into thinking you're safer than you are.
Yeah, in a way.
Wow.
It's a way of dealing with this impossible situation. And
Yeah.
for some people, that bond can stick around
Even after they're free.
even after they're out of it. Yeah.
That's so interesting, but it still feels so counterintuitive.
I know.
How can someone feel affection for someone who hurt them?
Well, it's important to remember that trauma affects everybody differently.
Okay.
There's no one right way to respond.
Right.
And our brains are incredibly adaptable.
Yeah.
We can develop all sorts of ways to cope.
Even ones that seem illogical or self-destructive from the outside.
Exactly. So the real debate is about whether this specific coping mechanism, this traumatic bonding,
Yeah.
is so different and unique
Okay.
that it needs its own name, its own category.
In mental health.
Yeah, and there are good points on both sides.
Okay.
The people who support the term Stockholm Syndrome,
Yeah.
they say it helps us spot this pattern of behavior
Okay.
that can have really bad consequences for victims.
So it gives it a name.
Yeah,
So it's not dismissed or misunderstood.
exactly. And having a name for it can help victims to understand what they're going through
Right.
and then get the right help.
Makes sense, but there's the other side too, right?
There is.
Why are some experts against that label?
Well, they worry about calling something a mental illness
Okay.
when it might just be a normal, even if it's extreme, reaction.
To captivity, to abuse.
Exactly.
It's like they're saying, don't call someone mentally ill just because they're trying to survive something horrible.
Right. They're afraid that using that label could actually hurt the victims more.
In what way?
Well, imagine someone's in a custody battle.
Okay.
And their experience with Stockholm Syndrome
Yeah.
is used against them, like they aren't mentally fit to be a parent.
That's scary. It also makes me think about how the media covers these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that affects the debate and maybe even adds to the stigma?
Oh, absolutely. The media loves a dramatic story.
Of course.
They love to boil down these complicated experiences into quick headlines.
Yeah.
And that can make people think that Stockholm Syndrome is about victims being brainwashed.
Right.
Or like they're choosing to side with their abuser.
When really it's much more complicated than that.
Way more.
It's about psychology, survival, and power dynamics all mixed together.
Exactly. And that's why this whole debate is so important.
Yeah.
It forces us to look beyond those easy explanations
Right.
and think about what it really means to label someone's response to trauma as a mental illness.
So how do we make sense of all this?
I know, it's a lot.
The labels, the perceptions, what the media says.
Yeah.
How do we get to the truth of what Stockholm Syndrome really is?
That is the big question, and it's one that researchers are still trying to answer.
Well, we've explored some of the complexities here.
We have.
And now it's time for the big question.
Okay.
Should Stockholm Syndrome be officially recognized as a mental health disorder?
Now we're getting to the heart of it.
This is where it gets really interesting.
It does.
Let's dive into those arguments after a quick break. Okay, so let's untangle this whole debate. Why do some experts think Stockholm Syndrome should be officially recognized?
Well, they argue that there's this really clear pattern of symptoms, you know?
Okay.
You see it over and over in these cases, like intense emotional bonds with the abuser, defending what they did,
Right.
having a hard time adjusting to normal life afterwards.
Yeah.
They say it's not just like random trauma responses, it's a very specific thing.
So it's like its own syndrome with its own, fingerprint.
Exactly. And recognizing it officially would actually do some good.
Like what?
First, it makes the victim's experience legitimate.
Yep.
Right now, they might feel ashamed or confused by how they feel.
Yeah, for sure.
But a diagnosis could validate it.
Take away the stigma.
Yeah, like saying, hey, this is real, it's not your fault, and there's help out there.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second,
Yeah.
a real diagnosis could get more research going.
Right, because if it's a clear category,
Yeah, exactly.
then you can study it better.
We can figure out how common it is, what causes it, what the long-term impacts are.
And all that research could lead to better ways to treat it, right?
Exactly.
Like therapies just for this condition.
Right now, we're kind of borrowing from PTSD treatments and other trauma stuff.
So it's not as targeted.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes sense that a more specific approach would work better.
It would.
But there's the other side, of course.
There is.
What are their reasons for not calling it a disorder?
Well, they're worried about, basically saying someone's mentally ill when it might just be a normal reaction.
A normal reaction to an insane situation.
Yeah, exactly. Survival instincts explain a lot of this, like you said.
Like appeasing your captor to stay alive.
Right.
It makes sense.
They're saying don't call someone mentally ill just because they're trying to survive.
Right, and they're also worried that a label could actually make things worse for victims.
Yeah.
How so?
Think about a custody case
Okay.
where someone's experience with Stockholm Syndrome
Yeah.
is used to say they're unfit to be a parent.
That's awful. And it also makes me think about, how the media portrays all this.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that feeds into the whole debate?
Definitely, and maybe even adds to the stigma.
Probably.
Media loves a good story,
Right.
They often oversimplify these really complicated experiences into headlines.
Which then makes people think Stockholm Syndrome is about being brainwashed,
Yeah, or choosing your abuser.
when it's so much more than that.
So much more.
It's all tangled up. Psychology, survival, power dynamics.
Exactly, and that's what makes this debate so important.
Right.
It makes us look past those easy explanations
Yeah.
and think about what it really means to call this a mental illness.
Okay, so where do we go from here? How do we acknowledge how real this is,
Yeah.
but also not label people in a harmful way?
That's the tough part. I think it starts with more research.
Okay.
We need more data, more in-depth studies.
To really understand it?
Yeah, the long-term stuff, how often it happens, what's going on in the brain.
And maybe with more research, we can come up with better terms.
Language that really captures it without being too simplistic or stigmatizing.
Right. It's about moving past those black and white judgments.
Yeah.
And recognizing that human behavior, especially in these crazy situations, is full of gray areas.
Exactly. And I think at the end of the day, it comes down to this.
Yeah.
If someone is hurting, if they're dealing with the aftermath of trauma,
Yeah.
no matter what we call it,
Right.
they deserve our support, our understanding, and the chance to get better.
Absolutely. That's something we can all agree on.
I hope so.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We went from like the beginning of Stockholm Syndrome to how hard it is to even define.
And the ethical questions, too.
Right. It's a good reminder that in psychology, there often aren't easy answers.
That's true.
Well said. But before we go,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Okay.
We've looked at the reasons for and against making this an official disorder.
We have.
But what do you think? Should it be in that DSM manual, or do we need totally different terms?
It's a good question to consider.
It is.
And hopefully this deep dive gave you some things to consider.
Some food for thought.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us as we explored Stockholm Syndrome.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.